Welcome, good afternoon, welcome to the third talk in the lecture series on global populism. My name is David Timberman. I teach political science and international relations and direct European studies here, and I'm delighted to see you here for this third talk in the series. In recent years, populism has gotten a lot of attention, primarily, of course, because of its influence in the North Atlantic area, Brexit, and the election of Donald Trump as President of the United States were two pretty big, pretty important events for us here. But populism, the word is not restricted to Europe or the United States. Populism is claimed as a global phenomenon. And that is why I'm very, very pleased to welcome this afternoon an expert on Southeast Asian and Philippine politics. And I'm hoping that he will be able to enlighten us a little bit about the causes of populism in the Philippines, the rise of President Rodrigo Duterte and his election in 2016. And in what ways is he or is he not a populist? So I think this is a very interesting and very important talk for this lecture series. And I'm very pleased to introduce David Timberman, who is our speaker this afternoon. And David is, I think, really a rare bird these days. Most people pursue one-track careers. You're an academic. You work in the private sector. And David really straddles these different worlds and combines them in really interesting and important ways. He's done a lot of development-oriented work for USAID, a lot of work for Management Systems International. He is also a scholar who publishes on Philippine politics, on Southeast Asian politics. I believe you're working on 2 books at present, which is very impressive because unlike professional academics, the sort of the very clear career incentive is not even there. So that shows that you're doing it out of real interest. There's an intrinsic motivation there which is driving you to do this. So I will shut up and we'd like to welcome you very much, David Timberman, to the University of Delaware, and we look forward to your talk.
Okay. Thanks. First, thanks to all of you for coming out this afternoon. It's a beautiful day outside, so I realize there's an opportunity cost for you to be here, so I appreciate it. And thanks to the university for sponsoring this series and asking me to be a part of it. And Daniel, thank you for that very nice introduction. I wish my mother could have heard it because it might have explained to her what I've been doing all these years. So I appreciate that very much. The topic for today is Duterte populism and or in the Philippines. There's a lot embedded, actually, in all 3 of those words, Duterte, populism, and the Philippines. And all 3 words, I think, tend to be subject to, actually, to oversimplification and maybe, to some extent, misrepresentation, depending on, what you're reading or what you're looking at. So what I want to do is actually sort of unpack all 3 of those terms a little bit, and of course try to explain what the relationship between them is or how they are playing out in the context of the Philippines. What I hope to do is not to simplify things for you necessarily, but maybe to complicate things for you a little bit. That is to say, try to explain what Duterte is all about. Certainly try to at least offer sort of my understanding of populism, which, if you are participating in this series or have read much about it, is a notoriously sort of slippery term and often applied, extensively applied lots of different leaders in lots of different situations. But then also to explain a little bit, for those of you who don't know about the country, the Philippines, the context that Duterte and the presumed populism is playing out within. And as I say, I think all three of these are actually quite, even though they might seem fairly simple and straightforward, are actually fairly complex subtopics. Of course, when you're in this business, we try to make things more complex because then we have more things to write and think about. So, that's what I'm going to do for the next 45 minutes or so. Okay, so I pretty much just stated this. What I'll do is first just talk a little bit about the term populism. I'm not sure to what extent it's been addressed in earlier sessions, but it is a contention, or at least there are a lot of contending kind of theories or notions of what populism is. I'm not a scholar on populism. I'm a scholar of the Philippines and Southeast Asia, but I'll give you my sort of working or preferred definition. Then, as I say, talk a little bit about the Philippines, because you can't understand Duterte and what's going on there now without some understanding of the political and socioeconomic context that it's playing out within. Then turn to Duterte, his election, a little bit about his government and his policies, and then come to the point of this issue, bringing it back to populism. So, what or in what ways can we say that Duterte is a populist? But maybe even more importantly, because it is just well, in a lot of cases, it's just a label. So what's the significance of that? So what? So what if he's a populist? And then conclude with just a little bit of a broader conversation of populism and other challenges to democracy in the Philippines. I'll say it here, because one other piece of my background is most of my work on Southeast Asia has dealt with kind of the issues surrounding and challenges surrounding democratization in countries like the Philippines, also in Indonesia, Cambodia, and Myanmar to some extent. So I tend to come at, and will come at this topic ultimately from kind of the issue of, so what does this all mean for democracy in the Philippines? That's ultimately my interest, okay? So, to begin with, just quickly, again, I'm not going to set out theories of populism. I'm not that expert on them, but having kind of reviewed the literature to the extent that I've been able to, let me first start with the reasons why I think we have to be kind of careful or circumspect about when we apply the term populism. And, and there are, as Daniel knows and all of you know, I mean, there are a lot of reasons, there are a lot of leaders and a lot of situations these days to which the term populist or populism often get applied, and not without justification. But I think given that we're in a university setting, it's important, to define your terms and be clear what we are and what we're not talking about, especially with a term like populism, which gets so broadly and I would argue indiscriminately used these days. Okay, so that's my first point. I mean, it's often just kind of normative, often pejorative label applied, whether it's Trump, whether it's Duterte, pick your region and pick your leader. And so is it, and again, I'm not going to delve into this, but what is it that makes somebody actually a populist as opposed to popular, or as opposed to authoritarian, or as opposed to just a strongman, right? So it's I would suggest especially among journalists, an overused term, so we need to be careful about it. Secondly, even in the academe here, there are a lot of different definitions, and this is a good thing. This is a good thing. I mean, there's a lot of discussion about, okay, so what really is populism? What isn't populism? But so there isn't a single accepted definition of what it is, or for that matter, again, what its significance is. Related to that, and again, we see this today, it's applied to very diverse countries and political situations. So, so then what does that tell us? If a term like that can be applied to so many different, leftists, rightists, developed countries, developing countries, across pretty much the political spectrum. So, how useful a term is it if it can be so broadly applied? Then fourth, and this is actually, I'm not sure in the reading I've done, I think it's interesting that I haven't seen anyone really address this. Is populism sort of an absolute, you are or you aren't populist, right? Or are there degrees of populism, or is it actually situational, partial and temporary? I will tell you a little bit about a couple situations in Southeast Asia where, people are populist some of the time, but not other times, or may not start as populist, but become populist. So is it how kind of organic is it? Or how or is it just used for instrumental purposes? And then lastly, again, a lot of my career has been doing kind of political analysis and trying to understand not just what has happened, but what might happen, and that's not that's not a scholarly endeavor. But so I'm often interested in, what's the analytical value of a term or a concept? So what can we use it for? And in particular, what does it explain about a country or a political system? And what, if anything, might it predict? And again, because of all these different approaches and definitions of populism, it's not clear to me that it's that valuable as an analytical term. But I was asked to talk about populism, so that's what I will do with those caveats, and for good reason, because as Daniel was saying, clearly there is a phenomenon that is global and has different manifestations in different countries, and maybe even if it's not absolutely accurate to characterize it as populism, there probably isn't a better term or better rubric, perhaps. So that's what we're working with, and certainly President Duterte has been labeled a populist. So I'm very happy to sort of explore the ways that he is or perhaps isn't a populist, and what that means, what that might mean. Okay, so here's what I will use. Important to define your terms. Basically, again, I'm not a scholar on this, but I've drawn heavily on the work of two scholars, one of whom will be speaking here in February. And so this will be just sort of my non-scholarly working definition or set of considerations. So first, sort of certain core elements of what populism is. I think there's probably general consensus on this, that it's anti-elite or anti-establishment, but that by itself is necessary but not sufficient. So that alone does not define a populist. Mueller would and others have argued also that it's also got to be anti-pluralist. That is, that it essentially divides society and politics into the people, with the populace representing the people, and everybody else who doesn't matter and is not the other, the ones who have it wrong or have no moral authority. So it does not recognize that there are competing different groups, interest groups, majoritarian, minority rights and dynamics in a society. It's the people and the other, basically. The other often being the elite, but not always. Third, this assertion of the moral authority of the populist leader or the populist party and the political legitimacy that comes with that, because they are ruling in the name of the people. Okay, so there's a moral dimension to this. as well, speaking for the legitimacy that comes from being representing the people. And then lastly, this notion, which is an important one, I think, that it's a malleable or thin-centered ideology, which is to say that populists and populism tend to have a series of kind of approaches and patterns of behavior, which I'll get to in a second, but that it usually then has to kind of glom onto or become connected to some other, in a sense, more potent political ideology. So you have, this is why we see, you have leftist populists and rightist populists and neoliberal populists or illiberal populists. So that populism itself doesn't really define a core ideology. It's more about, these particular core elements, but also about how they get enacted. So that brings me to these tendencies, which, again, I call them tendencies because they tend to be, these are pretty typical characteristics of populism, which you see most places. So it's often, not always, but often in response to a crisis. This was definitely the case in Asia at an earlier point in time. Or sense of grievance, which we certainly see in lots of countries, or a response to perceived or real threats and insecurity. And if you look at sort of right-wing, nativist populism in a number of countries, you could certainly see that that the threats and the insecurities can be a cause or a dynamic there. Populist governments, I should say, tend to colonize the state. That is, because they feel that they have the moral authority and the political legitimacy given to them by representing the people, they tend to start to take over state institutions and reshape them to better reflect their values and their priorities. Also, because of this rejection of notions of pluralism, that there are different legitimate contending groups in society, populist leaders and populist governments tend to be anti-civil society. They often tend to either repress civil society or try to co-opt it for their own purposes, kind of like colonizing the state. And then lastly, often in populist governments or populist regimes, corruption is legitimized. And again, for the same reason, because we have the moral authority, so okay, we're stealing or we're doing something, but it's all in the name of the people. How could that be wrong, right? So there's I don't know the numbers here, but there's there's a fairly, I think, historically a high correlation between populist regimes and also corruption. And then lastly, just to finish on this, there's a few other characteristics which often get pointed to or thought about with regard to populism. And I'm not the expert on this, but they may or may not hold true in all circumstances, but sometimes do. So one is, I think this is sort of one of the earliest notions, or at least my earliest images of the charismatic leader, the Peron or whatever, or Duterte, Marcos actually, the leader that people rally around. So charisma and a charismatic leader, often but not always, is an element of populism. Second, having a mass party or movement. Likewise, often a populist leader does have or build one of these, but again, not always. Sometimes they just emerge out of fairly standard political party or non-party situations, for that matter, and that's in fact the case in the Philippines. The third one is mass clientelism. For those of you who don't understand clientelism or patron-client relations, it's what a group, a leader, or a party will do, the flow of resources to supporters, to followers, to other organizations, particularistic flow, so that the things that a leader will grant to his or her followers to ensure that those people remain their supporters, right? So, and in traditional societies, that's are often formed on the basis of patron-client relationships between the patron, the powerful, the wealthy person who then looks out for his or her clients, but then who are expected to be loyal, right, and to support that person. So mass clientelism is when you have a government that basically is using clientelism, the distribution of patronage and benefits to different individuals and groups in order to maintain their base of support. So again, that's quite typical in populist regimes, but again, not always the case. And then lastly, and then we'll move on to the Philippines, this issue of sort of what a populist government's actually trying to achieve, and in particular with regard to sort of its economic policies. So again, earlier iterations, especially in Latin America, of sort of populist economic policies, typically involved redistributive economic policies, often linked to mass clientelism, but so where the government is trying to give benefits to the poor or to labor or to other key groups that can't actually be financed, by the revenues that the government has. So there tends to be, what would have been thought or might be thought of as kind of irresponsible social spending, irresponsible economic policies. Some of the issues that got Latin America into serious trouble back in the 70s and the 80s. But again, that was then, and that is not necessarily always the case now. So, just the fact that a government might have redistributional economic policies, or for that matter, mass clientelism, doesn't necessarily make them populist. So it's this combination of different factors and tendencies, which again, I don't pretend is, clean cut and clear, but these are the things I think, you need to be thinking about when you try to apply it to any leader or any situation. So that's what I'll do now. All right, the Philippines. Who has, I know some of you are Phil Ams. Anyone lives in or has spent time in the Philippines? How careful do I need to be? A few, yeah, okay, just a few. Okay, so I want to take just a couple minutes to talk a little bit about the country, because in some ways, like I think populism, it's much more complicated than, if you tend to read the newspaper, or especially if you're tending to read the newspaper and read about Duterte, there's a lot more going on there, and it's a much more complicated society. And I would argue that it's a lot of this complexity that both you have to understand Duterte and populism, but also it's what makes it also kind of just that much more complicated and unclear as to whether it's appropriate to have a simple label on. So, all right. So there is, as we know, the Philippines. For those who don't know the country, when I mentioned Duterte, he's from Davao City, which is down here in the far south in the island of Mindanao. I'll come back to that in a second. So I think there are 5 points, big points I want to make about sort of the general socioeconomic and political context in the Philippines, which you really have to just have a sense of in order to understand what's going on there today. The first is sort of the, if you want, the socioeconomic class composition of the country. A lot of people who know a lot of Filipinos and a lot of people who follow the Philippines talk about it as being an oligarchical society. There's a ruling oligarchy, and that's not wrong. But I would argue it's quite a more complicated situation there than simply that. So you do have, and very importantly, a very resilient political business elite in the country, which has endured over decades and generations. And I can talk more about that if you're interested, but a very resilient, very adaptive political and economic elite. Alongside that, so you do definitely have a small, wealthy class. They don't tend to be landowners anymore, which is sort of a kind of residual stereotype. But they're in business, they are in real estate, well, mostly real estate, malls, things like that. But alongside that, I mean, again, I think the country is known as having persistent poverty and inequality. It has long been similar to many Latin American countries in this way. It's always had one of the highest levels of income inequality in Asia, comparable to a lot of Latin American countries. However, I mean, over time, those levels of income inequality have been rising across Asia. So in fact, the Philippines isn't really all that, still somewhat worse than most other countries in East Asia, but actually there's been a convergence in that way. The bigger difference with regard to sort of the socioeconomic situation in the Philippines is poverty and the persistence of poverty. Whereas countries like Indonesia and Thailand, Malaysia, even Cambodia have, reduced the incidence of poverty quite dramatically over the last 30 years. In the case of the Philippines, it's just sort of slowly edged downward. And in fact, for a number of recent years, even though there's been very strong macroeconomic growth, on average about 6% a year over a decade, poverty was still hovering at poverty incidence at about 25, 24%. I mean, that's a quarter of the population of 100 million people, by the way. We're not talking about a small country. I should have said that at the outset. So a quarter of the Philippine population or more, has been impoverished. And that's only improved a little bit in the last few years. Alongside that, and the last point here, is that so while sometimes the country is sort of characterized as this rich oligarchy and the poor, everybody else, that's actually not really the case anymore either. You have a growing, not insignificant middle class, the way you do in most other developing Southeast Asian countries. Maybe as much as 10 or 15% of the total population is arguably middle class. That's another definition that's always very fuzzy. But so you have a real middle class, most of it essentially an urban middle class, but a middle class. So you do have this mix of sort of social classes, and that will be of some importance when I get to Duterte. There are also historical legacies that you need to understand. One of perhaps the other most famous, or one of the other most famous figures in contemporary Philippine history, besides now Duterte, was of course Ferdinand Marcos. And so you had a 13 or 14-year dictatorship under Marcos, which ended in 1986. So you have a legacy of dictatorship, which still has certain resonance in the country today. There's also a legacy and ongoing, although not all that significant, communist insurgency, but also along with that sort of a certain influence of leftist ideology, which still factors into Philippine politics a little bit, but isn't central, but is still an influence on politics. Then you have this very famous and significant the 1986 EDSA revolution, people power, when people came out onto the streets and overthrew the Marcos dictatorship, and democracy was restored under Corazon Aquino. So you have this legacy and this influence of mass mobilization in the form of people power. And then lastly, you have since 1986 this what I tend to characterize as elite democracy, and that is to say, this goes back to the first point about the oligarchs and the resilient political and business elite. You do have democratic politics, you have a degree of competition, you have a degree of checks and balances. So you basically have had all the key elements of essentially liberal democracy in the Philippines, and that's all embodied in the constitution that was implemented after 1986. But the reality is a lot of that is still very heavily influenced. The political processes, the policy-making processes, representation are all very heavily influenced by the continuing dominance of these elites, hence elite democracy. And then the last two that you have to understand, especially to understand Duterte, the Philippines, the political system is essentially modeled after the U.S. political system. Right, it was a U.S. colony, so it has a very strong presidential system. But combined with that, as I say, these political families or dynasties, which continue to have great influence locally and nationally, but also, and maybe as sort of the other side of that coin, to even talk about weak parties. I mean, in political science terms, that still means that they matter. They're just, I guess, they're weak. The Philippines has an almost meaningless political party system, and that's not really much of an overstatement. Parties are typically, I mean, there are a few small exceptions to this, but parties are typically simply the vehicles for contesting elections, for sort of organizing these coalitions of families and dynasties. But once it comes to governing or doing or even for that matter, being in opposition, they have almost no significance whatsoever. And in fact, I mean, as evidence of that, when, for example, Duterte won the election in 2016, he ran as president on a small regional party that had almost no representation at the national level. He won, rather, and so the party benefited. And then the vast majority of the members of the Liberal Party that had been the ruling party under the Aquino government all left the Liberal Party and joined this small regional party. So you have this huge party switching is just endemic and happens every election cycle. So, I mean, I've been in meetings with with the remnants of the Liberal Party, and I mean, it would not take a room this large to seat them all. It would be like the first row, maybe. So it's that bad a problem. So a weak party situation, which also has relevance for what I'll talk about. And then lastly, on politics, like Philippine society, and this is not unique to the Philippines, politics driven and organized very much by personalities, by leadership. Also, regional affiliations are important. So, you know, if you're from Mindanao, where Duterte is from, that matters to people in Mindanao. If you're from the Visayas in the central Philippines, that means you'll almost certainly get a Visayan vote for you, and likewise, if you're from up north in the Ilocos region, that means you'll vote for the Marcoses or their affiliates. So regionalism matters as well. And then lastly, that because of that, sort of ideology and class distinctions have not tended to be the key kind of determinants at least in Philippine election or electoral politics. So it's kind of this interesting, especially with the presidency, kind of this interesting wide open field, and well, I'll get to that because that sort of explains part of how Duterte became president. Okay, so that's in 10 minutes, like what you need to know about Philippine politics in order to be able to understand what's currently going on. All right, so let me turn to Duterte. oops, where is, there it is. And the first thing I want to do is situate him relative in terms of kind of where he's come from, literally, geographically, but also his experience, because again, I think that this has a lot to do with explaining his government and his policies. So, as I mentioned, he is from Davao City in the south of the country. Let's see where, there we go. Okay, there they all are. So he's 72, which makes him on the elderly side for a Philippine politician, though not that old. But importantly, it roots his sort of formative political experience at a particular period of time, both for the country and for Davao. So he started out as he was trained as a lawyer, so he knows the law. He was a prosecutor, so he understands prosecution. And then he was first appointed as mayor of Davao City, and then has been reelected a number of times. He also, as I note here, if he is considered a populist, he's one of those populists who's also from the elite, not the Manila elite, but from one of the major political families in the Visayan regions, that center part of the country. So he would be accurately described as, there are different kind of ways of characterizing populist leaders, and whether they're sort of outsiders, insiders, or insider-outsiders, and he's definitely that middle one. He's an insider, but he tries to portray himself as an outsider and sees other elites as being, not him and something that he's fighting against. Now, the thing that's important to understand about Davao, particularly back in the late 1980s and early 1990s, geographically, it's a huge city, thinly populated in a predominantly agricultural area, but it's also this kind of melting pot of Christian Filipinos, a lot of them having been immigrants from the Visayas, because like the Duterte family, land was available in Mindanao, and a lot of Visayans moved into Mindanao. So you had Christian politicians like the Dutertes and others, predominantly Christian, but you also had Muslims living in, and have Muslims living in Davao. Lumads, the indigenous peoples of Mindanao, would also come into Davao. So it was this much more of a kind of heterogeneous mix in terms of the different populations than you find in a lot of other cities. And at the same time, in the late 1980s and into the early 1990s, you also had a very active communist presence there, and in response to that, active vigilante groups. So the law and order situation in Davao during the late 80s and early 1990s was really messy. So it was kind of this sprawling frontier town kind of situation with all these different groups. It was that environment that Duterte came into. And as mayor over 20 some odd years, and staked his claim, and with some justification of sort of, restoring law and order, making it a safe city, which everyone would agree it is, but not without certain costs, but also compromising with, cutting deals, co-opting all these different groups, so that they all kind of felt that they were getting something, or that, he would listen to them. So in that sense, he's not just, in fairness to him, he's not just like this, I'm going to do whatever I want, fist down kind of guy. He had some real sophistication in terms of finding solutions to Davao's problems during that period of time. Let me be clear: this is not to justify his current behavior, but I think it's important to understand his background. Last point on this is importantly, the second to last one, the DDS. Those are the Davao Death Squads. Now, one of perhaps the most important way brought law and order to Davao City was to, I have to be careful how I phrase this, to, at a minimum, encourage and probably support and possibly participate in, these basically, well, what are now typically called extrajudicial killings. I mean, the unlawful execution of alleged criminals in Davao City. And so this became a well-known phenomenon in the late 80s and into the 1990s when Duterte was mayor. He was never, despite a few investigations that were done, it was never possible to implicate him directly, but certainly the prevailing view is that this would not have happened without his support and encouragement. So this is an important point in terms of understanding, what's going on currently in the Philippines, and that is namely that, this is not new. There's an antecedent to what's currently going on nationally, and it happened not just in Davao, but primarily in Davao earlier. Okay, and sorry, one last point, the one before it. Because again, this speaks, I think, to his style of government. As a mayor in a Philippine city or municipality, you are the boss. You have a council, and there are a few other people who matter. But when you're mayor, you run the place, and most people follow your line. And importantly, you run the police, and hence, his focus on law and order, and perhaps the approach of adopting the use of the death squads. But so, as a mayor, this is not a guy who was used to having significant political opposition, institutional checks and balances on his decision making or his behavior, or for that matter, even much in the way of media scrutiny, which there wasn't much of in Davao. So again, he comes out of a background that is not one that's sort of what we would consider sort of the background of a more sophisticated national level politician, not unlike certain other leaders we've seen in other countries. So that's a bit about Duterte and where he's coming from. And see, it is getting late, so let me move on. Okay, so briefly, the election. I just love this. I won't read it, but this was a poster from his election campaign. It's time to make the Philippines the most unsafe country for criminals to play and laugh. But all these little points underneath, relate to his experience as mayor of Davao, and this was important to his election. Okay. So in 2016, Duterte won the election with 38 or 39% of the vote. Not a majority, but a commanding plurality of the vote. It was a field of 5 people, which is typical in the country. And so he was elected president. So the question I want to raise here is, does this represent the triumph of populism in the Philippines, assuming we think he's a populist? And let me just again sort of unpack this, because it's, again, to me, it's not totally self-evident that that is the case. So why did Duterte win? Was it this great, upswelling of populist sentiment, or were other things going on? And you'll see, I think there were a variety of factors involved. First is, there definitely was ambivalence about the preceding administration, the Aquino administration. I won't go into this now, but it's actually quite interesting, because this is actually an administration that actually did quite well. At least I would argue, and I think most of the numbers prove that to be true. It's also an administration that wasn't tarred by huge corruption scandals and the like, which is fairly unusual. So So, you would think that maybe there would be continuity. But there was ambivalence about Aquino, well, not so much about Aquino, but his anointed successor. So that was an important factor. But he did certainly tap into anti-elite sentiment. As I've said, it's an elite democracy. It's a pretty standard election platform, to run against some element, some aspect of the elite. So that in itself wasn't necessarily anything new. But as someone from Davao, he was able to point the finger at sort of the Manila elite. And that had, resonance among a big chunk of the voting population, because a lot of people are in or near Manila. His campaign was based on, it was a very simple campaign, just based on a couple issues. Crime, which we now know he was serious about, but also change, that he would bring change, that he was the only one to bring change. And again, you think about Trump or others, and that's clearly a common characteristic. In his case, the change, or the most important aspect of change that he was in his campaign that he was advocating for, was switching from a unitary system. The Philippines is a unitary state to a federal state, and that actually has not happened yet, but I'll come to that. But then also there was clearly the issue of his personality. He, again, not unlike Trump or others, voters, he's crass, he's certainly machismo, some people would say misogynistic, but a lot of voters thought he was authentic, and he kind of represented kind of the everyday Filipino. And he was sort of unpredictable, which made him, again, not unlike Trump, I guess, which made him, always interesting to the media, and always sort of the subject of conversation. So he quickly started to capture, even though he wasn't that well known initially, he quickly started, to sort of become the topic of conversation for a lot of Filipinos and for the media. But then, and this is important, and this is why I think you have to be careful about, again, labeling his victory as a populist victory. There are institutional factors at play too. As I've already mentioned, he was one of 5 people running for president. This is just an institutional flaw, as far as I'm concerned, of the Philippine electoral system. So, and the other 4, all candidates, all had serious vulnerabilities. So he won in what was really a fairly weak field with 4 other people. I can talk about that if you want. But he also was very smart. Both the simplicity of his campaign, his message, but also he entered the race very late, actually at the very last moment when anybody could file for the presidency. And because of that, it meant that the Aquino administration or other political operatives didn't have the time to try to dig up dirt on him, find out what his record was really, get dirt on what happened in Davao, find out whether he was corrupt. A lot of the things which they did to tear down one of the other of the Jojo Binay, who was the vice president, who was a year before the election assumed to be the one who would hands down win the election, and he came in 3rd or 4th. So the administration did a good job of tearing down Binay because they had a lot of time to do it, and they didn't have that kind of time with Duterte. So that that's just a kind of hardball politics aspect of it. And then lastly, he did. The view is, well, it's not the view. People who know more than I do about this, he used social media very effectively. Both in terms of projecting his own message, but also, and this continues to be the case under his administration, to really tear down and harass his opposition. So there are a variety of reasons that don't really have to do with him being who he was or being populist, that were pretty important to his being elected. So just to be aware of that when you think about him as a populist. Okay, so is it a populist government he has? Let me just touch on this quickly. It's a disparate coalition. In fact, there are very few people in it who you would point to as being populist. There are members of the Mindanao political and business elite, traditional politicians, business people. You have really what this government is. It's a coalition of a lot of the elites that were against Aquino while Aquino was in power from 2010 to 2016. So you have the son of Ferdinand Marcos, Bongbong Marcos. You have Gloria Macapagal Arroyo, who was the former president, and then others like that who basically are the outs who are now the ins. So they're not populist. You have representatives of I mentioned that the left still has some influence in the Philippines. So you have representatives of the communist left who appeal to the people, but arguably really aren't populist either. And then you have members of the military and the police who aren't typically known as being populist either. So there isn't what you would consider to be a lot of sort of populist representation in the cabinet. He currently enjoys political dominance in terms of both because of the party switching and other factors, political opportunism as well, and just the power of the presidency. So you don't want to be on the other side against the president if you can avoid it. So he has majorities in both the Senate and the House, and he is, and this receives a lot of media attention. He regularly and unabashedly, not just criticizes, but often threatens, almost any group or individual or group in the country that dares to challenge him or criticize him, including, importantly, the Catholic Church, which is an important influence in the Philippines, not a dominant influence, but an important influence. So, that doesn't have, there's nothing about this arrangement that is inherently populist. All right, his priorities. Just listed here. I'll talk a bit more about the war on illegal drugs because that's the thing that is in the media the most. Economic growth is clearly important. He wants to accelerate infrastructure development. But this is largely a continuation, though an expansion of what the last administration did. I mentioned the federalism already, and it still is not clear whether that will in fact happen or not. Going back to his roots in Davao, he's I think genuine about trying to kind of bring to an end both the communist insurgency that's plagued the country for decades now, and also the Muslim insurgency that's taken place in the other side, Western Mindanao, for decades. So there have been talks in order to try to end those. And then the other point that's been in the news quite a bit, of course, is his, dramatic, criticisms of the U.S. and Obama and his sort of shift in favor of China, which even that, is not. Many people would argue that's just sort of recalibrating the Philippines' foreign policy to where it had been prior to the Aquino government, that the Aquino government, in fact, had become unexpectedly pro-American for a variety of reasons. Okay. Let me just touch on the drug war, because that is what people probably are most familiar with. There it is. This is truly some gruesome stuff. This is not the worst of it. If you haven't seen it, there was this amazing series of photographs in the New York Times. Let's see. This was now a few months ago. I think the title is like they're slaughtering us like animals, or is that right? Yeah. If you want to see, graphic representation of what's involved here. This is, just one image. But what's going on here? So let me just quickly. To begin with, this is clearly something, I think, Duterte does view drugs and crime as sort of this existential threat to the Philippines. That said, it was also very shrewdly used as an issue in the campaign. I don't think, well, I'm fairly confident in saying, let me put it another way, surveys do not show that drugs and crime typically are the top concern of Filipinos. I mean, jobs are, inflation are, education are, and then drugs and crime typically come in, fifth or sixth. So politically speaking, he or those around him were brilliant to seize on drugs and crime, which he could point to as having dealt with in Davao as being, a central issue for him. So it definitely had, political utility. But this is something he's continues to be serious about. And the point I want to make is, apart from, not to diminish in any way the fact that 7,000 to 12,000 alleged drug users and pushers have been, essentially executed, or at least, killed with almost little, if any, justification. Not to diminish that in any way, there are also important other consequences of this, and a few other aspects which I think I think it's useful to think about. The first is, there's a degree, again, politically speaking, I'm a political analyst, it's interesting, and looking at it through sort of a lens of populism, the drug war is actually the easiest war for him to fight. That is to say, the other wars that most Philippine presidents fight, the war on poverty or the war on corruption, that's what Aquino was elected, basically. Actually, it was combining the two. To get rid of corruption, you'll get rid of poverty. That was basically Aquino's election slogan. Duterte's drugs, as ugly as it is, you can, if you've got the police, you can just go out and kill people. It's, in a sense, simpler, than having to actually do all the structural changes that are involved in getting rid of corruption in a, society that's got endemic corruption, or seriously addressing poverty, which is, we've seen, has been very, very difficult to bring down for a variety of reasons in the Philippines. So the drug war was, in a sense, it's, again, not to be too cynical, it's a brilliant strategy in that regard. It's also, I'm speaking as politically here, it's also smart because, look at the cost and the political costs and the political benefits. The drug, it's a war against poor male slum dwellers for the most part. The people who threaten other people in the slums, or the people who threaten, other middle-class people who travel through the slums. It's not threatening really anybody else, at least not yet, right? So the political costs are quite low because these are the marginalized in society, and the political costs so far have been fairly high. I mean, this is what he points to as being one of his successes, even though there isn't really that much other than the death count. And then the last point would simply be, apart from the killings, and I was in the Philippines a month or so ago, and we've seen some of this. There are all these other knock-on effects of the drug war. I mean, through politics and governance and society. So this is totally, not totally, but significantly changed. The Philippine police has never been a wonderful, clean, model of integrity, but there was some professionalism, and this, in some cases, in some places. But this is, a fun, now the Philippine police is complicit in arguably in gross human rights violations, right? So that's that's putting the police in a very different place. It's, in a predominantly Catholic religious country, it's basically project, well, it's just dehumanizing, the victims. Anybody, and this is Duterte's message, anybody who does drugs or is involved in the drug trade deserves to die. I mean, he has said, this is not lying, he has said this. So, it's a complete dehumanization of these people. Putting aside any, human rights or anything else, it's just a dehumanization of these people. Third, I mean, there are the knock-on political effects. I mean, fear and intimidation. I mean, if you know that the president, through the police, can, eradicate just about anybody he wants, not to mention putting people, lawsuits and other things, that has an effect on how much you are prepared to speak out or how much you're prepared to oppose. So, so there's symbolic, there's messaging that's associated with this as well, that goes well beyond just drugs, right? And then lastly, you also see now the Philippine justice system, which has been, glacially slow and overwhelmed for decades, now is having to deal with at least those cases that do go to court, people who aren't killed. So you've got this inflow of, you've got a further overburdening of the justice system, and you have all the local governments, which fall under the purview of the executive branch. It's a unitary state, having to pursue, the drug war in different ways as well. So, you have virtually the entire government apparatus focusing on this one issue, often at the expense of other things. It's quite dramatic and remarkable. Okay, so to get to it finally, so is he a populist? These are some of the arguments for why he is, and I think they're valid. So he's identified drugs and crime as an existential crisis, and criminals and the elite who he would argue, have enabled them as being the other, the evil, the ones who don't matter. As I say, he's dehumanized some of them. He's clearly anti-elite or anti-establishment, but in a particular kind of anti-Manila elite way. This issue of ideology, a thin-centered ideology. I think it's so thin-centered that it's really even hard to identify an ideology, that he even kind of has an ideology. So I came up, just for the fun of it, with a new, maybe variation of populism, that is punitive populism. That is to say, again, so much of his message is, you're wrong and this is wrong, hypocrisy is wrong, drugs are wrong, the Manila elite, the Aquinos, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong, and I'm going to punish you. It's not that necessarily that I'm going to other than federalism, which he doesn't actually have a terribly clear notion of, I think, of what that would mean. But it's not like, so therefore I want to replace all of this with something else. It's like, I want to punish you. And then certainly he has, as in keeping with sort of what many populists do, he's definitely trying to, I think, intimidate and restrict civil society, political opposition, to sort of at least keep the Catholic Church on the defensive. The media, I haven't spoken much about that, but there's social media. There continues to be a great deal of intimidation that's conducted through social media. But on the other hand, the extrajudicial killings, it's an attack on the poor, but he hasn't really moved against, the real powers that be in Philippine society and in fact, as he's the second point, in fact, he's allied with a number of them, the anti-Aquino elite, and while there may be some slight changes in sort of the political economy, as devout business interests, and also Chinese money because of the new relationship with China. That may be changing the sort of the mix, the business mix a little bit. It's not clear that there's been very much of that, or that established oligarchs or elites are necessarily particularly threatened by him. He hasn't articulated a populist agenda, as I've already mentioned. His economic policies, so is it a populist economic? No, I mean, it's really largely a continuation of the Aquino era policies with some variations and some new tensions because there are members of the left in the cabinet, but the principal architect of his economic policy is a businessman from Davao. And he hasn't, well, I guess, I think it's safe to say he has a certain amount of his own charisma. He hasn't really, there hasn't been an obvious or successful effort to kind of build a new party or a mass movement, in support of him. That has yet to happen, at least. It could, I mean, it's only a year into his administration. I guess I've gone on too long, I won't go through this slide, but the only point here was going to be, because this is really the only session on Asia, Duterte is not the only example of, populism or partial populism in Asia. In fact, there's some, really significant ones. So there are, a number of Filipinos that have definitely had populist appeal or messages before, including a former president, Estrada, but also elsewhere in Asia, both in Southeast Asia and more developed Northeast Asia, Taiwan and Korea. You had, leaders that have arguably been populist as well. Thaksin Shinawatra in Thailand is perhaps the most interesting, at least in terms of Southeast Asia comparators, is an interesting case to look at if you're interested in Southeast Asia. And yes, these did a lot of these actually arose from the financial crisis that afflicted Asia in 1997-98. A lot of them, Thaksin being one important exception, and Chen Shui-bian in Taipei, he served out 2 terms, but a lot of them did not have particularly successful runs as populist leaders. And this last point is simply to raise as a question whether we will increasingly see sort of forms of religious populism emerging, with Indonesia being the most obvious candidate for that. So what explains Duterte's appeal? I think it's important, we talk about populist leaders. A lot of this, at least my talk, is focused on Duterte, the leader. But it's also important to think about populist publics, right? Because without the populist publics, you won't have the populist leaders. So just a few quick takeaways here. If you don't know anything else about kind of Duterte, the interesting thing, is that he was cross-class, and his appeal is cross-class and cross-regional. So he definitely had middle-class appeal. In fact, one of the other candidates polled more strongly among the poorest of the poor than Duterte did. So his appeal was cross-class and cross-region. Some of the explanations for this include some of the points I've already made. There has been economic growth, significant economic growth, but you have not seen a significant reduction in poverty or inequality. And even though the middle class, and I've seen this because I've been going to the country for decades, the middle class, the urban middle class is a lot bigger and a lot better off than it was 10, 20, 30 years ago. That doesn't mean they're any less dissatisfied in many ways or insecure. You probably hear about the traffic problems in a place like Manila, which are truly horrendous, but also concerns with their kids' education, with inflation, even though it's been quite low in recent years, crime, all of these things. So I at least have the sense that the urban middle class just feels that they've seen the country progress, and the rich are in fact getting richer, but the middle class, while they've done okay, still see a big gap and that they're not really, their concerns haven't been addressed. Now that sounds familiar too. I think there is in the Philippines and in Indonesia, I believe this is true too, kind of this cultural, we could talk about this, but an appeal of, the strong man, or in the case of the Philippines, so many Filipinos I've spoken to over the years talk about, oh, we need discipline, disciplina, but it's always like, well, it needs to be, it's not, this is not to disparage Filipinos, I have a lot of very good, but it's not that it's self-discipline, but discipline has to be imposed from above or someplace else. And actually, honestly, you see this in other countries which have stronger institutional foundations. Filipinos, succeed brilliantly in anywhere they go where there's an institutional framework. When there's not a strong institutional framework in a country like the Philippines, then it doesn't work out as well. So this desire for the imposition of discipline. And then, I've already mentioned this, ideologically and even politically, the Philippines is sort of this wide open game. There's no dominant ideology, there aren't dominant political parties. So it means that almost anybody, especially in presidential elections, and this is what happened with Duterte, if you're compelling through either your message or your personality or just because of circumstances, a weak field, almost any, it's only a slight overstatement to say almost anybody can be elected president in the Philippines. So there's just the opportunity. And then lastly, and this is a question that I haven't answered, how much of a role social media played in this, but also the role of overseas foreign workers. Some 10 million Filipinos are abroad. They are hugely important to the Philippine economy, and more humanistically, they send huge amounts of money back to their families. And with that, they have influence, or at least the assumption is that they have some influence over, their family's political behavior. And so what the imagery is, or how overseas Filipinos see the situation in the Philippines might also have some influence on creating this populist public. But that's just a theory. That's not something I don't think that anyone has tested. Okay, so I can come back to this. There are other threats that exist in the Philippines besides Duterte and populism, which may be the most immediate threat, but there are others. But there are also, I'm only in this business because I continue to have a degree of optimism about the beliefs of people in certain countries, including the Philippines. So I think there are some reasons to think that the Duterte phenomenon may not necessarily have legs or may just have to moderate itself. And these are some of them. And then lastly, let me just try to bring this back to the bigger issue. So what does Duterte and the Philippines contribute to our understanding of populism? As I said at the beginning, I think you need to just be careful about using the term populism or populist alone. I think is an inadequate descriptor of a regime or a leader. So, and not to say that it may be necessarily wrong, but you really, I think, need to dig down into what the discourse is, what the policies are, what the organizational dimensions are, what the populist public, what the public attitudes and sentiments are. I think it's also the next major point. While it's great to look at populism, I don't think that should, as political analysts, political scientists, and political analysts, I don't think you should be blinded by kind of that label so that you're not actually looking at the extent to which it's really about, can very well just be about another variation or tool in intra-elite politics. I happen to believe that a lot of political events are driven by, elite competition, elite groups and elite competition. So even though there's a populist, don't automatically think that he or she isn't a member of the elite and that what's going on isn't really a reflection of, as I say, it's sort of a variation on elite politics. Next point is, I touched on already, I think it's really important, and I think as social scientists or as political analysts, I think, and this is very true, I know we've been grappling with this here in the US, we need to do a better job understanding, popular attitudes that support populists and populism. And being really careful about, we sort of think it's grievances or we think it's insecurity but how do we really know that? Because as I said with Duterte, everybody's run against the elite. That's not really anything new. The economy. Well, the economy was actually doing pretty well. Drugs? Which becomes central to his campaign. Well, what's that about? And so figuring out what it is that people are really reacting to or responding to, I think needs a lot. We all have to do a lot more work on that. Then lastly, last 2 points are related. And this, again, is as much about the US as I think it is about the Philippines. I have certainly, as a long-time sort of practitioner in the field of kind of democratization and good governance, the apparent fragility of established liberal democratic norms is quite, to me, is something, it's been a painful thing to have to recognize. And again, not just in the Philippines, here. How much does constitutionalism really matter to us, right, or to the Philippines, right? When push comes to shove, are we going to defend some, not even a law, right, a norm, civility in politics or compromise? And sorry, I'm not meaning to go off on the US, but this is true in the Philippines too. So, these are norms, right? These are not, there's nothing that says it has to be this way, but these have been the established norms that are, central to liberal democracy. And it's just fascinating analytically, but worrisome as someone who values democracy to see how these can be eroded. And so lastly, there is, and maybe this will, Mueller will go into this, this debate, there is an argument that populism can be, a corrective for the flaws of liberal, kind of like shock therapy for the flaws of liberal democracy, and that ultimately it's a good thing. I suppose so. Then there may be cases where that's true. But at least based on my knowledge of the Philippines and the rest of Southeast Asia, it seems fairly clear to me that that's not the case, and that in fact populism poses much more of a threat to liberal democracy, and therefore we run the risk of its demise rather than as a corrective, at least in the short to medium term. So let me stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you for an extremely rich and very thought-provoking presentation. I think there's a lot. Thanks for sticking around, and I think we have some time for some discussion and for some Q&A. So please don't hesitate, speak loudly because it's a large room. Sure, we have questions. Please.
So you touched briefly about the anti-American sentiment that Mr. Timberman said, he really did run on kind of a platform of global nationalism in a lot of ways, although the definition of that is actually in the political era. But with the anti-American sentiment, I know from my opinion, when he said he wanted to tax innovations and price boxes and things like that, that was a big thing for them. So how do you think it kind of, my mother is very offended by the fact that she feels Duterte is saying Filipinos who are black in the Philippines are no longer Filipinos. That has a message on your overseas workers. So how do you think that's going forward, given the amount of immigration?
I didn't hear everything you said at the beginning, but he didn't actually run. He didn't run as an anti-American platform. Actually, that was not really much of an issue in the campaign. He was. I mean, he'd made it clear that he was not going to be as pro-American as Mar Rojas, who was Aquino's anointed, hopeful successor. But actually, I mean, I know this for a fact. Lots of people, including people in the U.S. Embassy, have been surprised at how anti-American he has turned out to be, and this is. I mean, there's, as I said, there's some. Part of it's totally rational. I mean, it's probably a useful corrective because Aquino had really moved, become quite pro-American, and obviously was challenging Chinese, interests in the South China Sea. But so there was, that probably made sense to do that. But there's also definitely a visceral, I mean, he's had some experiences with Americans and the U.S. over the decades, which I think it's pretty clear indicate that, he's got sort of a visceral dislike for the U.S. But I'm not quite sure what the other element of your question was, other than, but...
He discussed taxing the recidivations, Palestine boxes, and sending money back, which, if I'm not mistaken, Filipinos who have immigrated sending money back home made up for the entire trade deficit one year. So it was like some crazy...
Oh, well, remittances are, as I said, remittances are a huge contribution to the economy. That's a good question. I should know this. There's probably some sort of transactional tax.
Right now, there is not.
There's not. Yeah.
He spoke about raising it.
Yeah. Well, he may I mean, I suppose that's possible. It might actually be good policy. I mean, this is a country that needs to generate revenues. So if you treat remittances, inflows, the way you treat the inflow of money if you've sold something abroad, there's not, at least from an economic point of view, I mean, politics may be different, but there's not necessarily an economic reason why you shouldn't capture some sort of tax on the remittance. Now, that has huge, I mean, maybe this is where you're going, this has huge political significance, to be sure. And I'm sorry, now I'm remembering. The one point, he has been different than other, maybe this is what you're getting. He has been different than some other presidents, and he hasn't sort of glorified Filipinos abroad. Other presidents refer to them as, the Philippine heroes abroad and that sort of thing. And I think he has not had that attitude. That's correct. But the surveys indicate that they voted heavily. Overseas Filipinos who voted were heavily in favor of it. Are you, or yes, ma'am?
Question. Has the extrajudicial killings resulted to possibly catching the big fish that's running the drug industry, or they're really just targeting the poor, marginalized slum?
It's been almost exclusively the latter. I mean, there have been a few politicians that, he has claimed, or someone in his administration has claimed, are involved in the drug trade that have been victims, but it's a handful. I mean, literally, on one hand, and so it's almost exclusively, the marginalized, and there's no. I'm not aware of any, evidence that, that they've actually made that big an effort to move beyond even drugs, but to other crime. There's plenty of other crime, right? It's not just drugs. Other than, I mean, there's been some talk that, a lot of the methamphetamine trade a lot of that comes from China. So again, that may be, I think that's, to what extent the new relationship with China is addressing that isn't clear to me, but that may be a factor too. Oh, yeah, yes, sir.
I had kind of thought that a common model for kind of the appearance of populist nationalism was leaders who get into office and then don't want to leave, and so they develop populist nationalism. If you look like Putin or Erdogan or maybe what's happening in China, right? They don't want to leave, and so they develop this. But this is someone who got elected, basically, already a populist. Is he corrupt and therefore will seek to hold on to power to kind of maintain a kleptocracy? And also, kind of a related question, will populist forces in the region like to keep him in power because they also like that kind of a regime?
Oh, that's good. He was elected. The way it currently stands, the Philippines, the president's limited to a single term. So he isn't eligible to be reelected. That said, I mean, and I didn't go into this, it's not just the political changes that might take place aren't limited to just federalism. There's also the possibility that they'll move to a semi-presidential system, in which case, it'll be a parliamentary system so that the prime minister could, remain in office for any number of years. But he's old. He's 72 years old and not in good health. So it probably, my own guess, and it's just a guess, is that I don't think he has aspirations to stay in office, for years and years and years. Which is why, I just flashed this slide. I didn't go into it. The institutionalization of kind of Duterte, doesn't seem that likely. And moreover, the people around him who do aspire to be, president or prime minister, like Bongbong Marcos's son, or maybe Gloria Macapagal Arroyo again, they'll be squabbling among themselves. So you'll probably be back to, I'm just guessing again, kind of typical intra-elite competition. That's my guess. Others in the region, that's an interesting question. Well, I guess really the only other that really matters in this regard is China. So, which obviously, his election has been definitely a positive development for China and for Chinese foreign policy. So I wouldn't be surprised if, I think it's clear that they already, the Chinese are doing, what they can do to make sure he's a success. That said, I think, they're probably realistic enough to know, maybe have the same assessment that I just made, that, he may not be around for forever. So, you don't want to necessarily put too many eggs in that basket. Yes, sir.
I was wondering maybe if you could speak to the role of the military in the
Yeah.
context of Filipino
Yes.
politics. Because it's my understanding that although de jure they might be under civil control, they actually have a lot of autonomy. And I heard that with the insurgency that's going on in and out, right?
Yep.
Right now it's still ongoing, I think.
Yep.
That basically okay. One of them might be where they were occupying the town basically kicked off because the military moved in and captured somebody with the help of the United States.
Oh, Mount Sapano.
Yeah, and that Duterte didn't even have any knowledge that this operation was going on, and maybe a tension that's there, or maybe how that plays into anti-American sentiment.
Yep. Yeah, those are great questions. You got a little of that history wrong, but that Mama Sapano was under Aquino, not under Duterte. But so yeah, the role of the military. Great question. Step back. For those who know anything about Southeast Asia, there are some countries where the military has played like a central role in politics and government. That would be Indonesia, Thailand, Myanmar, okay? In the case of the Philippines, the military has never played that central a role. However, there was an extended period of martial law, military rule, but that was under Marcos, who was, to begin with and to end with, a civilian leader. So even the martial law period, even though it was implemented by the military and did serious damage to the military as an institution, was still essentially formulated and implemented under civilian leadership. Okay, so the role of the military in the Philippines is it's significant. It's autonomy. Yes, it's fairly autonomous, in part because most, honestly, in my own cynical view, most civilian politicians don't really see much benefit from getting involved with the military. I mean, in terms of the money they can make or the getting votes or what have you. Some Philippine leaders, though, have brought a number of military people, retired or otherwise, into the government. So actually under Ramos, who was a general who followed Aquino, he brought a lot of military people into the government. Duterte has done the same thing. He seems to think that the military, will get things done and maybe are cleaner. So there are a lot of military in the current government as well. What's interesting is their response, or questions about their response to Duterte's policies. So the fact that Duterte has moved away from the U.S. and towards China. The U.S. has always, historically, Philippine-U.S. military relations have always been very close. Military assistance, a lot of Philippine assistance to the Philippine military has come from the U.S. So that move to distance the Philippines from the U.S. Presumably has some in the military concerned. I think that seems to be the conventional wisdom. Likewise, the military has been basically on board with coming to a peace agreement with the Muslims in Mindanao, which has been, those negotiations have been going on for years, and that's where the Mama Sapano incident caused a breakdown in those negotiations 2 years ago. But the military is basically, I think, on board with a peace agreement with the Muslims, but they've been very worried because of their history as being anti-communist about a peace agreement with the communist insurgency and what that would mean, in terms of disarmament, what it would mean in terms of lawsuits, legal cases against, communists that they feel killed military, so amnesties and things like that. So that's also more complicated, or a complication in their relationship. So for the time being, the last point I would make is the current leadership, the defense minister and the senior generals, have all been very circumspect about getting involved in two of Duterte's projects, one being the war on drugs. He wanted to get the military involved. They essentially said, no, this is not what we do. Leave it to the police. But also, he, as you may know, he implemented martial law in Mindanao in the wake of the Marawi City conflict. And the military has been, likewise, it's very kind of light touch in terms of that. Again, that's martial law. So they're in control. But, you haven't seen, they've been very, again, circumspect, not, a light touch, not rounding up lots of people, not, apparently, there not being a lot of human rights violations. So it's not the martial law of the Marcos era. I think they're trying to make it clear that that's the case. So it's a very interesting issue, and ultimately the military can play an important role if other factors come to come to a head with regard to possible leadership change. Then the military becomes an important part of that equation. Short of that, they tend to be a little more restrained, at least these days.
Further questions? Any other questions? Before everyone leaves and we thank David again, I just want to let you know we have one more talk coming up. My esteemed colleague Julio Carrion is going to talk about understanding populist governance in Latin America on November 13th at 3 p.m. Allison Hall 227. Please take a flyer before you go. Thanks so much for coming, and David, thank you for a really